Hi everyone, this is Xavier from Pixel Fudger, and I have a special video for you today. I'll be reacting to a video by Carlos at RTC Roto Labs. So Carlos and I had a little bit of a friendly chat on LinkedIn, and the debate was, where do you put the edge on a roto when there's motion blur involved? So he posted a poll and he asked his LinkedIn followers, where's the best place to put the edge when you're doing a roto? So do you put it, if there's motion blur, at the end of the opaque area, in the middle of the transparent area, or at the end of the transparent area? Most of the people answered option C, in the middle, and let the software do the motion blur. And I answered option A, and use VectorBlur to rebuild the motion blur after the fact. And he made a very interesting video, very detailed, and lots of visual examples. I really appreciated the video. It was really good. I encourage you to go check it out. So in his video, he mentions that if you have something that's moving quickly in various directions, if you have an object that's not changing shapes, let's say a golf ball, and it's moving quickly, it's going to appear to stretch and squeeze because of motion blur, but in real life the ball is always round. So when you're rotoing the hard edge, you have to adapt your roto to the shape of the motion blurred image. So if the ball is moving quickly, you're going to have to make your shape thicker and thinner, whereas he's saying just keep the shape round and let the motion blur stretch and squeeze your pixels, essentially, by doing motion blur on your constant shape. The thinking behind that is to make your roto faster by having less keyframes. So he's saying, just instead of trying to follow what's going on with the motion blur, just keep the shape constant and just move it around to match the motion of the object. I think he severely underestimates how many keyframes he needs here and overestimates how many keyframes he needs here. I kind of a little bit disagree with his assessment, but the principle is sound though. In theory, that's true. You will end up with a few less keyframes, maybe quite a bit less keyframes, if you're not constantly trying to chase the shape that's warping with motion blur. The other part of the discussion was, once you've achieved your beautiful alpha channel, what do you do with edges that are transparent? So here's a real life clip, and here in the transparent area you can see the grass and the fence and the trees and the ground and the guy's shorts and his hand. So all those pixels are essentially corrupted. There's no way to use them if our intention is to extract the ball from everything else. So we have to rebuild those pixels. We'll see that comes with some problems, but before we get there, let's just try to do the roto using his method on a real clip, not a synthetic clip shot with a constant speed camera pan or something like that, just a real live ball. So I have my clip here. Let's create a roto node. I like to use a grade node to check my roto as I go along. Let's do the key poses first. So obviously we're not stupid enough to do keyframes every 5 frames or something like that. That's terrible. So we're gonna find a key shape. So usually on a case like this, you want to do your first key poses when there's very little motion blur. That means that the ball stopped and is about to change directions. So according to Carlos, I don't have to warp my shape too much. I might have to scale it, but I shouldn't have to chase the stretched version of the motion blur. So keyframe 1's at the top, 2's at the bottom, 3 is at the top again when it slows down and gets to the hand. So far so good, no problem. Either method would start the same way, so we're just rotoing the sharp frames essentially. Boom at the bottom here, so that's another key pose, and then another key pose at the top. Here we go, and our ball is farther away. We need to scale it down. All right, so far so good. We're pretty happy with this. So according to Carlos's little diagram here, I'm done, right? I just have to keyframe the key poses and I'm done. Well, not quite. So if you look here, I didn't do the first 3 frames, but you can see the ball is speeding up and slowing down, and that my shape is linear interpolation. So I at least need 5 other keyframes or 4 other keyframes to do the in-betweens, right? So that's where the problem starts, right? So here, or let's say here, and according to the little diagram on LinkedIn, I should put my edge here in the middle. But where's the middle? That seems like a dumb question, but it's more complicated than it seems. So I know the hard edge is here, right? Because at this stage, it's full opaque. I don't see anything. And it goes transparent, transparent, transparent. But where does it stop? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? It's hard to tell. And it's going to be different. If the ball's on the ground, the edge is going to look thicker. But if it's on the sky, at the same amount of motion blur, it's going to look thinner because the sky is going to overpower the dark ball in the mix. So figuring out where is the middle is not as trivial as it seems. So that's my first issue. So let's still try to do this. So I'm going to try not to deform my shape too much and aim for the middle, but only in the direction of the motion blur. So I don't like that kind of ambiguity. Carlos's argument is, well, roto people should be experts and should know what's happening, you know, in real life under the motion blur and understand what's happening in a camera sensor and so on. I agree with the sentiment 100%. You should understand what's going on in a camera if you aim to be a good compositor or a good prep artist. But still, I'm not a huge fan of operating blindly here. So, for example, on this frame, where should I put my spline? Somewhere here, somewhere. I don't like it. So, in theory, I shouldn't have to squeeze the ball because the squeeze is just from the motion blur. Or is it? Did the ball squeeze in real life? Maybe it's squashed because it bounced and it's a little bit squishy. I don't know. So I have to guess here. Guessing takes time and brain power. I don't like it. So let's keep going. So I'm going in between my key poses to put my missing keyframes to try to interpolate properly. Here we go. So now with very few keyframes, I'm not done, but I'm closer, you know. So I don't have to do every single frame just yet. So that's good. But we're not at 5 keyframes, you know, the way his little graph implied. I think that's a little bit misleading. I understand what he's trying to say. He maybe did a little bit of a shortcut to make his point more obvious. It basically simplifies the situation a little too much. All right. Okay, so now I've got, oops, no, see. You can't get away with that few keyframes when you've got real life and a camera that's bouncing around and so on. So hey, if you think you can do better, I'll put the link to the clip in the description and show me how it's done. Send me a nuke script where you can do a perfect roto of this ball with 7 keyframes. I would love to see how you guys do it. I would love to know how to do it. All right. Okay, so do I have enough to make my point? I think so. All right, so this is not done, but we're close, right? We're in the ballpark. No pun intended. All right, so this is good, and if we keep following the recipe here, what he's saying is you should turn on motion blur. So I'm going in the motion blur tab, enable global motion blur. So now we've got this motion blur alpha. That motion blur looks beautiful and it potentially can be perfect. So if we have the perfect roto with the perfect animation on our splines, we will have perfect motion blur. That's true because Nuke knows exactly where the roto is at every frame. It even knows where the shapes are in between the frames. So that's how it can build that beautiful motion blur. So as far as the alpha channel is concerned, the soft one, the motion blurry one, this is perfect. So I have no issue with that. This is an excellent alpha channel, potentially, if I was a better, roto artist. So if we use that to grade our plate, for example, You know, it's not perfect because my roto's a bit crap, but theoretically it would be fine. So that's good. So if my intention is to just do proper roto with motion blur, having basically an alpha channel that represents what's happening in the plate, I'm done, right? So if the only thing we need to do is grade the ball, for example, change its color a little bit, that's perfect. I wouldn't argue otherwise. This is a great way to work. Keep doing that. The issue becomes when we try to comp the ball on something else. So if we're trying to extract the ball and change whatever is behind it. So let's create a background. I'll do a checkerboard. And then we have to combine our plate and our roto here. So we're going to do a copy node. A is the alpha, B is the plate. And then we're going to do a pre-mult node that looks like that. So now we have our alpha and the alpha channel and the pre-malted RGB here. And you can already see the problem. When we combine the two together, this doesn't look the way it should, because we see the trees and the guy's leg and the guy's hand and the fence and everything in the background. So the problem right now is we're using the RGB pixels that are corrupted. We're using these unusable RGB pixels. So we have to fix that with something. Carlos says use some edge extend node. He's using some edge extend node that I couldn't find online. I've never used before, but his argument is there's a bunch of them out there. Pick your favorite one and use whatever edge extend node you like. So I'm going to use the one that's come built into Nuke since Nuke 12, which is called edge extend. And I'm gonna put it ahead of my copy node, connected to the matte input. And now we need a hard edge. So no matter which technique you use, at some point in your comp tree, you're gonna need that green edge, the A edge here. So he's saying do an edge extend, but to do that we need a hard edge. And his point is, well, if you have a soft edge, you can get a hard edge for free. Just get a grade node, for example, grade the alpha channel or all 4 channels, lower the gamma, whoops, put my viewer on it, lower the gamma, and if you lower the gamma enough, you're gonna get a hard edge for free. So you get both automatically. So that's good, I guess. So we're gonna use that. Make sure that the alpha is really white. For some reason, when you turn on motion blur, Nuke doesn't put pixels all the way up to 1.0. So we need to amp up the gain a tiny bit. Oh, white clam's not turned on. There we go. All right, so now this is white, this is black, and we have a couple pixels on the edge like that, but essentially this is a hard matte, and we're gonna use that. So let's label that hard roto, moblur roto. Here we go, like so. Clean that up a little bit. All right, so now my edge extend, I need to point it to the right alpha, so it's the matte alpha. It's not pre-multiplied yet. I'm gonna lower the detail amount because I don't want the legs and the trees to come back. Here we go. So what's happening now is that whatever is on the edge of that hard roto is going to be stretched into infinity towards the outside of the frame. So if we're on the dark side of the ball, the dark pixels get spread out. If we're on the bright side, then the bright pixels get spread out. So this is essentially Carlos's setup, just with a different edge extend technique. And we're gonna copy our soft alpha with the edge extend version and pre-mult. So essentially we're replacing whatever was corrupting our edge with something else that's more like the real color of the ball, and then we can use that to comp. So if you have a white ping pong ball or white golf ball that's a bit out of focus, you're done essentially, because the alpha is good. The alpha is really good. The RGB can be good if you have something that's got very even color here, because the edge extends just going to take whatever even color and spread it out. In our case, this isn't working because our ball here has some texture. There's some text on the ball, there's some seams, there's some whatever stitching. So all that stuff, when it's in the motion blur, creates some streaks, and the edge extend doesn't. So when we look at it here, we end up with this gray mush where we should be seeing streaks. All the texture in the ball has motion blur streaking that we don't have here. So some of you might go, well, Xavier, you have your own tool, PXF Filler. You can make it directional, or Foundry has a tool called InPaint that can be made directional. So InPaint is essentially edge extend with directional control. And you can do that by using the matte inverted alpha. So this is essentially the same as edge extend with the added benefit that you can make it directional. So if you crank up the amount of stretch, you can change the direction. So that works if everybody is going in the same direction. Here the ball is spinning on itself, so this side needs to go left and this side needs to go down. I can only do one side, one direction here. So we need to have multiple InPaints, one going left and one going down. If I have 4 balls bouncing in the frame, then I need possibly 4, 5, 6 InPaints all adjusted differently. Even if the entire ball is all going in the same direction, not spinning on itself, as the ball is bouncing, I have to keyframe the direction to match whatever direction the ball is going. So this is tedious and this becomes unusable essentially. So this will work on a very simple scene, but if you're dealing with very simple scenes, you shouldn't be watching this video. Your job is easy. We're talking about difficult scenes here. So this is not really a real option. So let's go back to edge extend, which is not directional and goes all around, so that's fine. This doesn't have the right amount of detail. Also the issue, which is true on any method, is we need our hard mat to be extremely precise. No matter what technique we use, at some point we gotta push our hard mat exactly where it needs to be. So if we look at it here through a gray node, we gotta make sure our hard roto isn't too big, because if it's too big we're getting the background, and not too small like here, because we're chopping a portion of the ball. So we need to tweak our roto. So now we have a little problem. If we did the hard edge from the beginning, if we rotoed to line A here, we would see that we're off. So now my overlay doesn't match what's happening in my hard mat, because this hard roto is becoming soft with the motion blur, and then we chew it with the gamma to bring it in. So now my overlay doesn't show me where that hard edge is, and to me this is more important than the soft edge. I want to control exactly where the hard edge is. The soft edge doesn't matter that much to me. If it's a little bit too much outside or too inside, by the time it's got blur on it, I don't care that much. When it's hard, that's when I care about it as a comper. So this is annoying, because now I'm flying blind. Whenever I move that spline, that's not where that edge is going to be. It's going to be somewhere inside, and that's going to vary depending on how fast and slow the ball is moving. If it was just that, I could probably live with that. The main problem I have with this is, since this is motion blur dependent, if I adjust my roto precisely here, if I move these keyframes, the next and previous keyframe, it's going to change my edge here, because if I make changes to the previous keyframe and the next keyframe, that's going to mean the speed is going to change, because I'm moving the shape further away, for example, in the next keyframe, and then the midpoint of the motion blur will be in a different spot. When you're sitting on a keyframe, you expect this not to move. This is not the case anymore, but because now I'm dealing with motion blur. So if I do a big change on the next keyframe, let's do something really wacky. Now my previous keyframe is completely wrong. Even though I didn't change it, I just changed the next one. So this makes, let's undo our little change here. So this makes working really tedious, because every time you adjust something, you screw up what's happening on the previous and on the next keyframe. So this is very annoying. The other issue I have with working with this is that now I'm screwing with the anti-aliasing and the feathering, because essentially to get my hard edge, if the ball stops moving quickly, like at the beginning it's pretty slow, then I end up with no anti-aliasing on here, because the gamma is at the same time getting rid of motion blur and also getting rid of anti-aliasing. If I had done option A, then I would have anti-aliasing because I don't have to do a extreme gamma down after the roto. So that's the gist of it. This is the main reason why I don't like it. All right, so at some point we end up with a hard roto, no matter how we do it, either by doing option C and gamma down, or option A and not having to do anything to it because we're already where we need to be. Once we have our hard mat, then we have to decide how are we going to rebuild those edges. If we do edge extend, I don't think it looks very good. So my option would be to use a PXF vector edge blur, which is the other discussion we've been having. So if we do PXF edge blur, vector edge blur, sorry, and we just copy our hard alpha and pre-mult like so. So we've got our image, copy pre-mult, and then chuck a vector edge blur. Now you can see the difference. So this is the edge extended and this is the vector blur. So vector blur, by knowing the direction of the movement, will smear or edge extend in the right direction. So essentially we end up with the motion blur streaks that we expect and that we want, and that looks good. So that's good. And if we comp that on top of our background, this is what it looks like versus this. So if you had to pick between these two versions, let's say these are the only two versions available to you, which one would you pick? Would you pick this one or would you pick that one? To me, the answer is clear. However, this is not accurate to the plate. That's true. This is Carlos's point, is that this isn't accurate to the plate. The motion blur is not where it should be. The contents of the motion blur is not great, but its actual fall off and everything is essentially perfect. So if we do a paint node, for example, so the motion blur stops here, starts here, essentially. If we compare that to our version, we can see that we're offset. So our version is off by half the width of the motion blur. So we're too far in and we're not far enough out. This is true. This is a real problem. If you want to be really picky about the math and everything, this is true. We're offset here. So I was thinking, this is a little bit annoying. Personally, if I had no other solution, I would still pick this version because I think it looks better, but it's not as accurate in terms of coverage, of motion blur coverage. So let's try to fix it. So first problem here, our motion blur doesn't go far enough. All right, so first we're gonna make our motion blur go all the way to where it should be, the yellow line. That's good. But now we've made our problem here even worse. Now this is way more transparent than it should. This should be opaque. Everything beyond the blue line should be opaque. So we need to change the opacity of our alpha here. So let's unpremult. This will essentially remove the gradient from our RGB. We're gonna grade the alpha channel and we're gonna gain it up. So if we look at the alpha channel here, this part shouldn't be gray, it should be white. So if we crank up the gain all the way to 2, now our edge, our opaque area starts farther out. And we're gonna white clamp because we don't want those pixels to be at 2.0, we want them to be at 1.0. All right, so now we've graded our alpha, essentially boosting the gain times 2, and let's pre-mult again. So now we've essentially offset our gradient in our alpha channel. And if we look here, this part is opaque, this part is transparent, and it goes all the way to where it should be. But this is fake motion blur, and I know that the plate here is opaque. The real plate, if I look at it, is opaque in that area, so we want to use that. That's the part that's a little bit iffy, but I agree that it makes the shot looks way better. So we're gonna create a new alpha, semi-soft, semi-hard version of our alpha. So we're gonna take our alpha channel here, we're gonna grade it again, just the alpha, and we're gonna chew it a little bit. So let's say gamma like this, And we're gonna crank up the gain a little bit and clamp it so the middle stays at 1.0. So essentially we're just chewing it, but not as hard as our true hard roto. And I'm gonna copy that chewed alpha with the plate and remold it like this. So now we've got the inside of the ball here, and then we can comp that on top with an over like this. So essentially I'm putting the original ball on top here. And now I can look at this. So this is the edge extended version, and this is the VectorBlur version. So essentially now our coverage is in the right spot. The ball is, the motion blur reaches all the way where it should, and it's not transparent in areas that it shouldn't. So this is the VectorBlur version, and this is the edge extend version. So I think the choice is pretty clear if you ask me, but let's go at another frame. So that roto is the one I did with you guys in 2 seconds, so I don't know how good that's gonna look. Yeah, that looks pretty nasty. Here we go. So I'm gonna swap the roto. I've tried to do a better job earlier just to see how far I could go with it. So let's connect it here. Yeah, so that's roto has way more keyframes, which would be horrifying to roto experts, I guess, but that's the best I could do, working pretty quick. So if I look here, so this is the edge extended version, and this is the VectorBlur version. So A, B, A, edge extension, B, vector edge. So I think the choice is pretty clear. So here, I think the next version of Vector Edge Blur will include those features. Essentially, that little branch here at the bottom, or those two branches, will be built into a future potential version of Vector Edge Blur. But in the meantime, this is how you would do it. Which brings us back to our original question. Why are we doing the roto with motion blur if we're never going to use it? So essentially here I'm paying for motion blur that I'm not going to use. This motion blur is useless. I'm getting rid of it here with the gamma, and I'm never using it. I'm never using the motion blur version, and it makes my life extra hard to really finesse that hard edge to put it in the right spot, because I can't see where it goes, and it keeps messing with my previous and next keyframes because of motion blur, and I have to guess where the middle is. So I've got to somehow figure out where is the midpoint between the hard edge and the soft edge in this crap here. So I much rather roto the hard edge, see exactly like, oh, okay, there's a bit of shoe inside the spline. Well, I need to move the spline in. Of course, it's going to create a few more keyframes. I think it's a small price to pay. This is, of course, very shot dependent. It might be a huge price to pay if you have a shot that's 3,000 frames long and you have something that's constantly the same shape. So you got to, be smart about it. But I think of just blanket saying option C is the best one all the time, I'm not sure. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll put the clip. This is a clip from Pexels in the comments if you want to give it a shot. So this concludes my little video. Thank you to Carlos for making his video, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.